The streets of Ouagadougou had never seen anything like it. A dusty haze lingered in the morning air, and from every direction came the bleating of goats, thousands upon thousands of them, spilling into the boulevards like a living tide. Cars froze in place, drivers leaned on their horns in futility, and pedestrians pressed against walls as if the ground itself had come alive. The city's heartbeat was interrupted, replaced by the unrelenting rhythm of hooves. Children laughed and pointed, chasing after the animals with wide-eyed wonder. Elders, their faces carved with lines of hard years, shook their heads in disbelief. "This is madness," one muttered, gripping his walking stick. "Goats don't belong here." Shopkeepers scrambled to protect their goods, pulling tarps over piles of fruit and grain as the sea of animals surged past. From a rooftop, a woman shielded her eyes against the rising sun, unable to look away. Was this a festival? A strange religious ritual? Or had chaos finally overtaken the capital? News cameras zoomed in, capturing every surreal moment. Broadcasters spoke with urgency, their voices echoing across radios and televisions. Burkina Faso is witnessing an event without precedent. And yet, there was no panic in the air, only awe, confusion, and a gnawing question that spread faster than the animals themselves. Why? Why would a head of state, why would a president, unleash millions of goats into the arteries of his nation? The bleating chorus grew louder, almost mocking the disbelief of the onlookers. A taxi driver leaned out his window, shaking his head. "This can't be real," he whispered, though his eyes told him otherwise. Across the street, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking, "Mama, are we rich now? Did the president give us goats?" It was a scene that defied logic. To some, it looked like folly. To others, a mystery too strange to ignore. Headlines would soon circle the globe, commentators would sneer or marvel, and rival politicians would scramble to make sense of it. But one thing was clear. This wasn't random, and it wasn't madness. No, this wasn't chaos. It was a president's plan. And as the world leaned in closer, the truth began to emerge. The goats were not just animals on the street. They were a signal, a message, a declaration. Not of celebration. Not of confusion. But of war. War on poverty itself. To understand why the sight of millions of goats flooding the streets mattered, you have to zoom out beyond the chaos of that morning. Burkina Faso is a landlocked nation, a patch of earth in West Africa that has carried the weight of poverty for decades. Here, the soil is stubborn, the rains fickle, and the climate cruel. In good years, farmers coax life from the ground. Corn, millet, sorghum. In bad years, the land cracks open under a merciless sun, and families stare at empty bowls. Hunger isn't an occasional visitor here. It's a constant shadow. Add to that the global shifts of climate change. Seasons that once had rhythm now mock predictability. Torrential floods come when the soil is thirsty, and droughts stretch across years when crops are most needed. In villages, children walk for miles with plastic jugs just to find water that's muddy at best. The question of survival hangs heavy, day after day, season after season. And yet, through all of this, one companion has never abandoned the people: the goat. Goats have been the quiet currency of survival. They are cheaper to raise than cattle, hardier in dry weather than sheep, and small enough to be kept even by the poorest families. A goat is more than an animal. It is insurance, nourishment, and dignity. Its milk, rich and easily digestible, feeds children who cannot stomach cow's milk. Its meat, lean and light, is prized across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Its skin, supple and durable, becomes leather for shoes, belts, and bags. In every way, the goat sustains life. In Burkina Faso, nearly every rural household owns at least one. For many, their goats are their savings account, their fallback plan, their legacy. But here is the brutal irony. While goats could be the foundation of resilience, their true potential has been left untapped. Farmers sell them cheap in local markets, often under pressure, often for less than their worth. Middlemen profit. Elites dismiss them as primitive. And the nation continues to bleed economically, chained to dependence on foreign aid and vulnerable imports. Now shift your gaze outward, beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The world is hungry. Populations rise, diets shift, and climate change stresses global food systems. Demand for alternative dairy is surging. Goat milk, goat cheese, goat yogurt. Products once niche are now booming industries in Europe, the Gulf, and North America. Goat meat, too, is quietly becoming a luxury item in restaurants from Dubai to New York. Global leather and pharmaceutical markets rely increasingly on animal byproducts, many of which goats can provide. This is where the stakes sharpen into focus. If Burkina Faso could turn its national reliance on goats into an organized large-scale industry, the ripple effects would be seismic. For the people, it would mean food security and steady income. For the government, it would mean economic independence. And for the world, it would mean a new supplier entering markets worth billions. But the alternative? If nothing changed, if goats remained undervalued, if farmers remained trapped in cycles of debt and drought, the nation risked collapse into deeper poverty. Hunger would grow, migration would surge, and dependence on foreign aid would chain Burkina Faso tighter to the whims of outsiders. That's why the goats in the streets were not simply livestock. They were the embodiment of a gamble. Survival versus collapse, dignity versus dependence, hunger versus hope. And yet, what followed wasn't just about goats, it would shake international market. Every story of resistance has its villains, and in the saga of Burkina Faso's goats, the shadows were cast not by local herders or weary farmers, but by powers that saw Africa not as a partner, but as prey. For decades, international monopolies have had a stranglehold on the continent's food systems. Global corporations dictate the price of grain, seeds, and fertilizers. They sell pesticides and loans to poor farmers, then swoop in to claim their harvests when debts cannot be paid. To these corporations, Burkina Faso's farmers are statistics, not people, pawns in a global chess game where profit is the only king. The arrogance was palpable. In conference halls of Paris, London, and Washington, suits scoffed at the notion of goats being a cornerstone of an economy. They dismissed the animal as backward, primitive, a relic of pastoral Africa that had no place in the sleek machinery of global trade. Goats are for peasants, one trade delegate once sneered. If you want to grow your economy, buy our cattle feed, our hybrid cows, our imported milk powder. But while they laughed, the contradictions in their own world were staggering. In wealthy cities across the West, mountains of food rotted behind supermarket doors. Perfectly edible meat and dairy were discarded daily because of cosmetic blemishes or expiration labels that meant little. Buffets ended with garbage bins overflowing. Farmers in France were paid subsidies to destroy excess milk. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, children went to bed hungry, and women walked for hours to find food to cook. It wasn't just neglect, it was design. By flooding African markets with cheap imported milk powder and frozen meat, foreign powers ensured local farmers could not compete. Every glass of imported milk poured in Ouagadougou was another nail in the coffin of a struggling goat herder's livelihood. Every container ship docking on African shores tightened the dependency, making nations like Burkina Faso perpetually reliant on aid and imports instead of their own strength. The corrupt elites at home were no better. Politicians in tailored suits signed deals that enriched themselves while strangling their people. They smiled in front of cameras, praising development partnerships, while behind closed doors they collected bribes and commissions. For them, goats symbolized poverty, something to hide, not embrace. They longed for skyscrapers and SUVs, for symbols that would align them with global elites. They didn't see the quiet resilience of the herder with 5 goats on a dusty plain. They saw embarrassment. The tragedy was layered with irony. Goat milk was already in demand across Europe and the Middle East. Goat cheese graced luxury tables in Paris and Rome, sold at prices that could feed a Burkinabe family for weeks. Yet the very nations importing this delicacy ridiculed the animal's worth when it came from Africa. It was hypocrisy disguised as sophistication. And so the stage was set. Foreign monopolies squeezing the farmers, corrupt local elites selling out their people, and a world laughing at the idea of goats as anything but symbols of poverty. Burkina Faso was trapped in a cage built of arrogance, exploitation, and ridicule. But villains, however powerful, often miss the simplest truths. They underestimate. They dismiss. They ignore what doesn't fit their narrow vision of strength. They never saw the goat for what it truly was, a survivor, an equalizer, an engine of possibility. The Western corporations had their cattle, their industrial farms, their gleaming dairy factories. They boasted about efficiency, productivity, modernity. Yet in that very boast lay their weakness. Their systems required perfect climates, massive infrastructure, endless water, and subsidies. Goats required little more than resilience and care. In the harshest droughts, they still produced milk. In the poorest homes, they still offered nourishment. In the most forgotten corners of Burkina Faso, they still stood as the one unbroken thread between despair and survival. And that was the crack in the armor of the so-called giants. For all their billions, they had no answer to an animal that could thrive where their technologies failed. For all their arrogance, they had no defense against a leader who might turn goats from a symbol of poverty into a weapon of resistance. In the air-conditioned halls of power, the elites never considered goats worthy of a second thought. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, in the villages stretched across the Sahel, one man was watching. One man saw what the world ignored, felt what the elites mocked, and believed in what others discarded. And he would turn ridicule into revolution. Long before he was called president, before cameras followed his every move and headlines carried his name across continents, Ibrahim Traoré was simply a boy of the soil. His story did not begin in marble halls or wealthy homes, but in the dusty villages of Burkina Faso, where the sun baked the earth and survival was a daily negotiation with nature. As a child, he knew hunger not as an abstract concept but as a gnawing ache in the belly. He saw his mother stretch a pot of millet to feed not just her own children but neighbors who had even less. He watched elders barter goats in the marketplace, not for luxury, but for survival. A single goat could mean milk for weeks, school fees for a child, or medicine for the sick. To outsiders, goats were a mark of poverty. To young Ibrahim, they were life itself, stubborn, resilient, unyielding in the face of hardship. He grew up among farmers whose hands were calloused from tilling soil that yielded too little. He heard the frustration in their voices when droughts came and aid shipments failed. He felt their pride when a herd survived the dry season, and their heartbreak when disease swept through livestock. These experiences carved into him a deep truth. The dignity of a people is rooted not in what the world calls wealth, but in what sustains their lives. When Ibrahim joined the military, it was not ambition that drove him, but duty. He saw in the uniform a chance to defend his people from forces both within and beyond Burkina Faso. In the barracks, he lived simply, ate sparingly, and trained with relentless focus. His fellow soldiers described him as a man who listened more than he spoke, who shared his rations when others went hungry, who carried himself with a quiet authority that inspired loyalty. But even as he trained with rifles and tactics, his heart remained tethered to the farmers and herders he left behind. When he returned home on leave, he would sit with villagers under the shade of baobab trees, listening to their worries. They spoke less about politics and more about survival, about goats stolen by rustlers, about the price of milk, about how foreign imports crushed their markets. And Ibrahim listened. He understood, because he had lived it too. His rise to the presidency was not the polished path of elites. He did not inherit power through family wealth or foreign endorsements. He rose because he represented something rare in the political landscape: authenticity. When Burkina Faso found itself suffocated by corruption, insecurity, and foreign meddling, it was Traoré who stepped forward. Not as a polished statesman with rehearsed speeches, but as a soldier who knew sacrifice, as a son of the soil who carried the scars of his people's struggle. In rallies and speeches, he spoke not in the language of technocrats, but in the simple words of farmers and workers. He promised dignity, sovereignty, and a return to self-reliance. And the people believed him because they saw themselves in him. His face was theirs, his story was theirs, his dream was theirs. But what set him apart most was not just his political vision, but the lessons of his childhood. While others in power dismissed goats as a symbol of backwardness, Ibrahim remembered them as salvation. To him, goats were not weakness, they were wealth. They were not relics of poverty, they were the seeds of resilience. Where the world saw shame, he saw strength. Where the elites mocked, he found meaning. It was this conviction, forged in hunger and humility, that prepared him for the boldest move of his presidency. Because only a leader who had once counted goats as the difference between survival and despair could see their true power. Only a man who had lived that reality could dare to challenge the arrogance of global powers with something so deceptively simple. And so, as Ibrahim Traoré rose from soldier to president, from villager to visionary, he carried with him the memory of his childhood. Memories of goats bleeding in the fields, of his mother trading milk for grain, of hunger overcome not by foreign aid but by local resilience. Those memories were not burdens. They were blueprints. For in the end, his life's journey, from dusty roads to presidential palaces, was not about personal glory. It was about restoring dignity to a nation mocked for its simplicity, belittled for its traditions, and silenced by powers that never cared to listen. And this childhood lesson, seeing goats as wealth, not weakness, prepared him for his boldest move yet. The morning after the streets of Ouagadougou filled with goats, the headlines rolled in like thunder. International media didn't waste a second turning the scene into ridicule. Goat chaos in Africa, blared one outlet. Burkina Faso's bizarre experiment, mocked another. Late-night talk shows in New York and Paris turned the images into punchlines. Comedians sneering as audiences laughed at grainy footage of goats swarming highways. To the world outside, it was comedy. To the people inside, it was an untested gamble. Foreign analysts filled TV screens with smirks. A president doesn't release goats when his nation faces hunger, one pundit scoffed. This is desperation, not leadership. Think tanks wrote grim essays predicting economic collapse, investors whispered about pulling out, and diplomats quietly questioned whether Traoré had lost his grip. The global elite, comfortable in their distance, believed they were watching a failure unfold in real time. Closer to home, the knives cut deeper. Burkina Faso's own elites, those who had always measured progress in terms of skyscrapers and imported cars, snickered in private salons. They mocked the president openly. Goats will never save an economy. For them, goats were symbols of the village, of poverty, of everything they wished to escape. They wanted shiny development projects that impressed foreign donors, not herds of animals filling city streets. To them, Traoré was embarrassing the nation on the world stage. But among ordinary people, the mood was far more complicated. In marketplaces, women selling vegetables exchanged curious whispers. Farmers stood quietly, leaning on their hoes, waiting to see if this plan carried real weight or was simply another politician's spectacle. Children laughed and ran after the goats, their joy free from politics. Elders sat on benches, shaking their heads in uncertainty. Was this brilliance masked as madness, or folly disguised as courage? The tension grew heavier by the day. Radio stations buzzed with callers arguing passionately. Some insisted Traoré had shamed Burkina Faso. Others countered that for the first time a president was actually trying something bold, something rooted in the land itself. At least he is not begging, one caller said. At least he is not waiting for the West to feed us. He is telling us to stand on our own feet. Yet doubt lingered. Could goats truly spark an economic revolution? Could milk and hides and meat replace the sophisticated systems of global trade? Skeptics painted grim pictures of disease spreading, of chaos multiplying, of a nation reduced to ridicule. Hopeful voices answered back, pointing to the resilience of goats, their ability to thrive where nothing else could. And hanging over it all was the question no one could escape. Was Ibrahim Traoré a visionary leading his people into a new era, or a dreamer pushing his nation toward disaster? The debate wasn't just local anymore. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike watched closely. Some mocked, echoing the West. Others leaned in with quiet fascination. What if it worked? What if a small nation, long dismissed, could rewrite the rules of survival with something so ordinary, so overlooked, so humble as a goat? Every passing day made the stakes clearer. This was no sideshow. It was a confrontation between two worldviews, the arrogance of elites who measured success by foreign approval, and the raw determination of a leader who believed in his people's own resources. The laughter abroad only fueled the suspense at home, because in every joke, in every headline calling it goat chaos, lay the unspoken fear of the powerful. What if this strange, mocked experiment actually worked? And so the world held its breath. The people of Burkina Faso waited, nervous and hopeful, caught between ridicule and revelation. Was this a mistake that would backfire, or the spark of a new era? The president did not respond with speeches full of excuses or with defensive fury. He stepped forward with a map, the kind of plan that stripped politics of pretense and turned it into engineering for a people's survival. On live television, in the square where goats had earlier clogged the boulevards, Ibrahim Traoré addressed a nation that had been trained by history to expect nothing. He spoke plainly, with a voice steady enough to slice through mockery. "We have long bent our heads under systems designed by others," he said. "Today, we reclaim what was always ours. Our goats are not embarrassment. They are assets. We will treat them as such." Then he laid out the steps with surgical clarity. First, organize the herders. The government would create cooperatives in every province, registering goats, sharing veterinary services, and building local collection points. Mobile clinics and vaccination programs would reduce livestock disease and protect herds. Training centers would teach modern husbandry, nutrition, breeding, and disease prevention, empowering women and youth who already tended the animals. Second, build processing capacity. Milk would no longer be sold informally at roadside stalls where it spoiled and fetched pennies. New processing plants, small, modular, and locally run, would pasteurize, standardize, and package goat milk and dairy products. Cold storage and transport hubs would be funded to keep quality intact. Value-added production, cheeses, powdered milk, skincare bases, would capture the margin that previously slipped through farmers' fingers. Third, formalize meat exports. Slaughterhouses built to international standards would ensure cleanliness and traceability. Packaging facilities would target regional markets hungry for lean goat meat and international niche buyers looking for sustainable, ethical sourcing. Tanners and leather workshops would be modernized, turning skins into high-value goods. Shoes, jackets, artisan accessories. Fourth, back the industry with finance and policy. Price floors would guarantee farmers fair payment. Microcredit would finance pens, feed, and refrigeration. Tax incentives and export facilitation would invite ethical buyers while protecting domestic supply. Trade negotiators would open corridors to markets where goat products command premium prices. The plan promised not charity, but a predictable market and dignity for those who had labored in obscurity. He paused. The square held its breath. Cameras caught faces close-up, a woman with a milk-stained apron, a teenager who had never owned a pair of shoes, an old man who had bartered 5 goats to pay a teacher's fee. Tears welled, then fell. The crowd's disbelief was turning into something else, something like cautious hope. 1 goat can feed a family. 1,000,000 goats can feed a nation. That line landed like a bell. It echoed across radio waves to remote villages where the internet barely reached. It landed in the ears of traders in Casablanca and restaurateurs in Dubai. Economists scribbled it down and asked, half laughing, whether the president had finally gone mad. But within days, analysts who had mocked the spectacle began to parse the policy. They traced supply chains on maps, calculated margins, and realized how little investment could transform tiny herds into organized export-ready clusters. The laughter in editorial rooms softened. Pundits who had sneered over late-night panels found themselves invited to government briefings. A consortium of socially minded investors, drawn by the prospect of impact and return, quietly approached development banks. A few NGOs that had once fought goats' neglect began drafting partnership proposals. The narrative had shifted. What had once been fodder for ridicule was becoming a case study in adaptation. Inside Burkina Faso, something subtler unfolded. Farmers who had long been passive sellers were courted as partners. Women's groups, long marginalized in the rural economy, were recruited to lead dairy cooperatives, manage processing sites, and run distribution cells. Young men, whose options had been limited to migration or menial labor, were trained in logistics, refrigeration maintenance, and artisanal leatherwork. The plan promised jobs, real, traceable employment, that anchored households and kept families from the impossible choice of fleeing or starving. Enemies of the policy reacted in predictable ways. Markets gorged with panic sellers in the first week, as some speculators tried to short the narrative. International advisors issued cautious warnings. Transition risks are real. Disease could spread. Infrastructure must be built. Yet those warnings, framed as fears, began to play into Traoré's hands. Proof, he argued, that the system had long been set up to exclude ordinary people. The mic drop moment was not a rhetorical flourish. It was the administration's willingness to translate rhetoric into budgets, timelines, and measurable targets. When the first processing plant was announced with international partners signed, when export paperwork began to move through customs offices, when the first refrigerated truck drove from the countryside bearing labeled cartons of pasteurized goat milk, the tone changed. What had been a spectacle now looked like the first chapter of a program. And as the world watched, skeptical eyes opened to a difficult truth. Ridicule had been easy. Building something real would be hard. But the hardest part of all might simply be admitting that the world's maps of value had long been wrong. Outside the capital, in villages and trading posts, people whispered a new language. Price, profit, processing. Words that had once been the preserve of distant technocrats. Those whispers turned to conversation, then to motion. Men who had once sold a goat for a bowl of rice began to ask for receipts. Women organized rotas at collection points. Boys who had chased the goats now learned to drive the trucks that carried their milk. And somewhere in the quiet of the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré watched film of children milking goats at dawn, of young technicians fitting refrigeration coils, of women stamping cheese labels. He did not celebrate a soundbite. He measured spreadsheets and timelines. He had delivered a plan the world had mocked, and the first real steps had begun. The laughter had not fully died. It still lingered in editorial rooms and foreign salons. But respect, cautious, incredulous respect, was beginning to replace it. International papers that had mocked the spectacle now ran sober op-eds pondering market potential. Trade journals that dismissed goats as anecdotal began publishing supply chain analyses. Economists recalibrated models, technicians sketched logistics, and a few skeptical ministers found themselves drafting contingency plans. Even rival governments sent envoys to learn rather than jeer. The ridicule had become a study in hubris. The mockers were forced, slowly, to reframe the story. The world had to look anew at what had been overlooked. The question that hung in the air, thick and sudden, was no longer whether the plan could be imagined. It was whether the nation could pull it off, and whether the world would let it. The moment Traoré finished his speech, it was as though the air itself cracked open and spilled into every corner of the digital world. Within minutes, the hashtag #GoatNation began trending across West Africa, then leapt continents. Memes flooded timelines, some playful, some reverent, some biting. A viral TikTok showed goats marching in slow motion to triumphant orchestral music, captioned, "When your president turns ridicule into revolution." Another clip overlaid his line, "One goat can feed a family. 1,000,000 goats can feed a nation," against cinematic footage of bleating herds moving like waves. Overnight, Burkina Faso became not the butt of a joke, but the epicenter of a conversation that no one could ignore. On the streets, farmers felt the shockwaves most directly. The same goats they once sold for pennies were suddenly worth negotiating over. Middlemen who had exploited them now came offering higher prices, and cooperatives were being formed in villages that had never before trusted collective systems. Elders who had worried about their grandchildren leaving for cities now spoke with renewed confidence. If goats are gold, then our land is a bank. For once, the currency of their survival was not in someone else's control. It was theirs. Celebrations spilled into marketplaces. Women who had long carried jars of goat milk on their heads walked with new pride, joking that they carried liquid treasure. Herders paraded their flocks down dirt roads with heads high, their animals suddenly elevated from symbols of hardship to symbols of national pride. A proverb began circulating, "He who mocks the goat, mocks our survival." It wasn't just rhetoric, it was vindication. Internationally, the ripple effect was electrifying. News anchors who had laughed days before now ran serious segments titled, "The Goat Economy." Can Burkina Faso lead Africa's next agricultural revolution? Economists appeared on panels debating whether goats could indeed rival cows in efficiency and climate resilience. Environmentalists highlighted how goats thrived in drylands without the vast water demands of cattle, calling the plan a model for climate adaptation. Even rival African leaders were drawn into the narrative. Some mocked from a distance, wary of being associated with something so unconventional. But others, quietly impressed, dispatched teams to study the unfolding model. "We laughed at sheep once too," remarked a South African commentator, pointing to New Zealand's history, where sheep farming had transformed a small, overlooked nation into a global agricultural power. The comparison stuck. If sheep had once built empires, why couldn't goats do the same? On social media, comparisons multiplied. Videos juxtaposed footage of skyscrapers in Dubai with goats in Burkina Faso, captions reading, "Two visions of wealth, both valid." A viral Twitter thread charted the global value of goat products, ending with the line, "The joke's on us, Burkina Faso might be sitting on a gold mine." But perhaps the most telling shockwave came not from elites or commentators, but from ordinary citizens abroad. Diasporas in Paris, New York, and Abidjan began using goat emojis in their profiles as a badge of pride. African youth who had long been bombarded with narratives of inferiority found in #GoatNation a playful but profound assertion. Dignity could spring from the very thing the world mocked. Still, the story was far from simple. Investors smelled opportunity, but also risk. Critics continued to scoff, warning of volatility. Yet the global press, once united in laughter, was now fractured, half still mocking, half stunned into reconsideration. And in that fracture lay Traoré's victory. He had disrupted the narrative. Every historical shift begins with disbelief, and disbelief was giving way to something else. Curiosity, perhaps even grudging respect. The laughter of the powerful had not silenced the pride of the people. Instead, it amplified it, spreading their story far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. But what this meant for the people on the ground was even more powerful. When the dust settled and the last goat disappeared back into the corrals, the world could finally see the truth. This was never about chaos. It was about clarity. What seemed at first like a bizarre spectacle, a nation's streets flooded with animals, was in fact a carefully staged declaration. Ibrahim Traoré had not unleashed disorder. He had unveiled dignity. For generations, nations have measured their strength in tanks, missiles, and parades of soldiers. Leaders have stood tall beside weapons of destruction, equating firepower with sovereignty. But Traoré chose a different stage and a different army. His troops were goats, his arsenal milk and meat, his battleground the silent war against hunger and dependency. In that choice lay a lesson more profound than any weapon could teach. Goats, humble and unassuming, became symbols of resilience. Where drought scorched the earth, they survived. Where poverty cornered families, they provided. Where outsiders saw weakness, Traoré saw untapped wealth. In elevating the goat, he elevated his people, reminding them that the resources to thrive had been with them all along. It was not the world's approval that defined Burkina Faso's future, but the confidence to value what others mocked. The contrast could not have been sharper. While superpowers flexed nuclear arsenals, Burkina Faso flexed something far older, far wiser. The knowledge that survival is not about who can destroy the most, but who can sustain the longest. In the global theater, goats stood as living proof that strength need not roar. It can also graze quietly, multiply steadily, and nourish deeply. And the lesson did not belong to Burkina Faso alone. Around the world, ordinary people, immigrants building lives from scratch, workers dismissed as insignificant, communities mocked for their traditions, saw themselves reflected in this story. The goat became a metaphor for every overlooked strength, every underestimated voice, every resource written off by those too arrogant to see its worth. Because real power, Traoré reminded us, is not about what others hand you. It's about recognizing what is already in your hands. The people of Burkina Faso learned that their goats were not just animals. They were currency, sustenance, industry, and pride. The world learned that a nation dismissed as poor could, with vision, redefine wealth. And we, the witnesses, were reminded that progress is never found in mocking the humble, but in honoring the essential. In the end, millions of goats weren't just roaming the streets of Burkina Faso. They were marching the nation toward freedom.